I'll give you your things.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So today I want to do the first of a series of 2 presentations. You might think of this as the first of a series of 3 presentations if you include the one I'll do next week. For today and tomorrow I'm going to be talking about culture. The point is to build up to the statement of a paradigm for the creation or the development of culture. Emily was the one who came up with the idea. I think it's right, and I think it's going to allow us to incrementally develop in the direction of having a culture that does the thing that we want. Now, of course, obviously, we have a culture. Right? We inherited most of it, and we've made a bunch of sort of not entirely random, but a bunch of makeshift modifications, some amount of intelligent design. But the thing that we're living with, I think, now is not adequate for our purposes, and so as part of this I'll be arguing, I'll be talking about what's necessary for the creation of a culture, why in general one needs to do that, why in particular we need to do that. In order to talk about all of that stuff, I have to build up to it. There's a whole bunch of background. Some people will be, especially the people who are the most sort of deep in the relevant research, will be familiar with a number of the different things, maybe most of the things. And if you're not, then the background is essential. So I'm going to start off going through a bunch of the phenomena that we've encountered, and then I'm going to present a new model of intention transfer. There's been lots of talk of magic and so forth. I'll be arguing that what you see isn't actually magic. Underneath, there's a perfectly normal explanation for all of the things that are happening. At least in some sense, perfectly normal. And then I'm going to talk about a bunch of the results that have come out of the new way that we've been looking at the mind. I think that we've learned a lot about how the mind is set up and what that means about humans in general and what that means about us in particular. And I think that it means a lot in terms of the things that we're going to have to do. My own self-understanding and the way that I've understood everyone in general and all the people in the group has changed dramatically as a result of a bunch of this. Then I'll briefly talk about group dynamics and field delineation, because I think group dynamics is its own field, and I can explain why. And then I'll talk a bit about the history here leading up to what I've been calling the intention war, and then this will set the stage for the statement of the culture paradigm and setting up what I'll do tomorrow, which is then setting us up on the direction of creating a culture. Okay. I think history is really interesting, and we're going to need to figure out a bunch of the historical facts pertaining to our group in particular at some point here. Various people have tried this, but so I want to just go through in a rough historical sort of order a number of the things that we encountered, and sort of as we broke open the new area of intention interaction and intention transfer. So I think the first one was, so I'm just going to note these. So there's this fun activity that I sort of figured out Sama was doing all the time, which is social articulation. It turned out that there was this weird phenomenon where you could get people to pay attention to something like what everyone thinks, or what society says about a thing, and you could tap into that, and it looked like when people did this, they would reach agreement way more quickly than seemed to make sense. Usually if you get people to reach consensus on theoretical topics, or most topics apart from the location of physical objects, it's very, very difficult. Nevertheless, we found people syncing up. This led me to conclude that there was this thing, the social packet, which is this incredibly dense amount of information that seemed to be shared by everyone, sort of like a script was being distributed to everyone that sort of told you what to do, and it was possible to tap into it. Usually, your role in the script is not to talk about what's in the script, though. And so despite people having access to the information, they didn't talk about it. After that, we got into vibe articulation. We played the vibe game a whole bunch. And a number of us spent time, you get the, vibe of a person, or the vibe of a presentation, or the vibe of a group. And again, weirdly, we found that people seemed to be able to sync up. It's not that people were completely perfect at this. They're sort of, but it seemed like people synced up quite a lot, and that the places where they didn't, there were sort of reliable patterns. So you'd find that, well, where a person was blocked themselves, then they had trouble reading the vibe, or at least they came to different answers than other people. People frequently would see one part of the elephant rather than another part of the elephant. There's sort of more to be said there. We found that people were able to sync up, and then when we would check, when we started using this in recruitment, you interact with the person a little bit, you get the vibe, you interact with them more and more and more, and you find out, well, okay, actually the vibe reads look like they're pretty good. Well, that's interesting. Then also added social articulation for the group. This sort of destroyed my original theory of what was happening with social articulation. There was this social packet. I thought maybe the media, especially through word choice, is rapidly disseminating information and everybody's syncing up on that. So there's some sort of like central command of communication. But then we found it was possible to query the social packet, or at least our group's social packet. So you could look at, and you could do it not just for us, but if you had enough contact with the EAs, you could look inside and see what the EAs thought about X, or what the rationalists thought about Y. This was incredibly weird, because you'd have people, Samo and I would be talking and checking the social packet for the group, and it's like Geoff and Samo aren't talking anymore. We're like, that's weird. Do you also get that? Yes. Message some people, hey, what does the social layer in the group say about Samo and I? It's like, well, you guys aren't really talking that much anymore. It's like, huh, interesting. Okay. Well, then this doesn't seem like something distributed by the media. At least not any media I'm familiar with. It seems like instead something else going on. We also started encountering attention sync phenomena. So you'd have weird stories where person A is training person B, and person B is trying to introspect. Person A, patiently waiting, is trying to debug themselves and also can't introspect. Suddenly, person B manages to introspect, and at the exact same time, it sounds like person A comes to be able to introspect. Coincidence? Okay, but you start racking up more and more stories like this, and it, seems peculiar. We add to the mix simple, what I'm calling simple body/energy work, where the thing you do is direct attention inside of a person's body, and this causes various types of updates. Notably, though, you don't need to tell them to do this. You can do this just by touching the person, or you could do it even without touching the person. So it seems like there's these non-verbal methods of directing the person's attention, and as you do that, then it's able to cause updates. Why updates? Well, because people update where they pay attention. There was also the weird sort of noted phenomenon of simultaneous changes in the group social layer, where a person would report, hey, I'm finding X in the social layer. Ask around, it looks like other people are also finding the same thing. And it looks like it changed around at the same time. That's weird. Is there like some sort of central distribution mechanism changing everything? Are people changing it as they talk to each other? And frequently you get really sort of like, interesting and weird things. At one point the social layer seemed confused about whether Jonathan had a beard. He shaved his beard, but the social layer didn't seem to have been able to catch up, but it didn't really think he still had a beard, and then multiple people are there finding exactly the same thing. It's like, all right, well, it seems like this is related to reality in some way, though not perfectly. I also noted, and it's really hard to track this stuff down. Maybe there's channels of normal communication that that you just don't see. But it looked like we were getting simultaneous discovery, where people in different groups are finding the same things at the same time. Okay, simple theory one, they're working at similar paces with similar skills in a similar area, and so are discovering things in a natural track. Simple theory number two, there's actually a lot more communication than it seems. Weird theory, maybe there's this nonverbal communication that's causing people to sync up. So it's sort of like the group mind is moving forward at a particular pace. We add to this the phenomenon of local intention sync. This is started having people introspect. I remember doing a bunch of these activities with Anya where she and I would find and look at our intentions, and it's like, okay, I'm doing X, okay, that's because you're doing Y. Am I doing Y? Yeah, but okay, that's because you're doing Z. I'm not doing Z. Oh wait, no, I am doing Z, but that's because you're doing A. Okay, well, how many layers are here? A lot. And it looks like as soon as you start talking to the person, the people sync up super fast. Add to this, then body or energy reading. I'm going to start calling it just body readings. I think that will be I think it's a more normal term, and I think adequately captures the things. But then you start getting much weirder things like practitioners can introspect for the other people. You put your hand on the person or not, and then read off their beliefs. It's like, all right, that's new. And then this yields complex, what I'm going to call complex body/energy work, where the simple one is just you direct the person's attention inside their body in some way. The complex one is where you're interacting with the thing just like it's a regular psychological structure, except that you might be doing it entirely non-verbally. And then this leads to all sorts of really sort of weird and interesting patterns where person A picks up an intention from person B and renders it explicit, processes it, and passes it back to the other person, picks it up without having checked, and then it turns out they check and their beliefs report are flipped and the issue is solved. You can think of that as intention transfer. We start finding people with other people's intentions. It's like, oh, that's interesting. I've got a person X object. It seems like it's doing A, B, and C in my mind. So this is the sort of background and build-up. As far as discovering weird things, I think we were doing an extremely good job. What's happening? Well, the first thought is we don't know. A bunch of these things sort of seemed unrelated. Social articulation seems somewhat related to vibe articulation, except that the vibe thing is happening in person and the social thing is happening ambiently somehow. And you can see how intention synchronization could explain, some of the things. So maybe that's like tied together. But it looks like the things are changing quite a lot. They seem to be notably synced up. And then a bunch of the body and energy phenomena, at least initially seemed quite different from social articulation. All right, so after the not having an explanation, we moved to the explanation of magic. Not everyone bought into the magic explanation, but it seemed like a particularly attractive way of describing a lot of things that were happening. And this is because there are pre-existing terms in the language for a bunch of the phenomena, like, for example, mind reading. You're like, you believe A, B, C, D, and E. I can tell that because, anyway. Okay, that, yeah.
Well, it seemed like most people were being jokey around the magic thing, but maybe the claim is that underneath they weren't actually...
Well, there's an interesting question about what the people believed underneath, and I think that you should distinguish a number of different views. One of the views is it's literally magic, in the sense that it's mechanismless and fits the general characteristics of magic as shows up in Harry Potter.
Maybe supernatural.
What?
Supernatural might be better.
Well, so, I mean, when you say supernatural, if there's something like direct mind-to-mind interaction, does that count as supernatural?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. If it seems like Harry Potter and then people can turn each other into newts, then, yeah, I'll call that magic. That seems really good. If it just turns out that the physical world doesn't exist, instead you have a whole bunch of minds whose perceptions are synchronized with one another in such a way that it looks like that there's a physical world, and then there's direct mind-to-mind interaction, and that's how the fundamental nature of the universe works, I don't think you'd start calling that supernatural. It's at least very strange. But then as far as people's endorsements, some people have been endorsing that there is direct mind-to-mind interaction. And I'll say a bit about that. And if you have direct mind-to-mind interaction and you have a whole bunch of magic-seeming phenomena, then maybe you're sort of joking while saying the thing is magic, but that's also then the way that people are thinking about it. So you get mind reading, maybe you get telepathic control, because you're, after all, non-verbally determining other people's mental actions. You start to draw connections between this and widespread, historically noted purported phenomena like the evil eye. The evil eye, I think, is a great example. The list of countries, I think this is so Wikipedia says, the evil eye is a curse believed to be cast by a malevolent glare, usually given to a person when they are unaware. Many cultures believe that receiving the evil eye will cause misfortune or injury. Talismans are created to protect against the evil eye and are frequently called evil eyes. The evil eye charms, which are used to repel it, are a common sight across Armenia, Albania, Algeria, Tunisia, Lebanon, Turkey, Greece, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, India, Palestine, Morocco, southern Spain, Italy, Malta, Romania, the Balkans, the Levant, Afghanistan, Syria, and Mexico. It also, the idea that someone looks at you, you don't notice, maybe you did notice, but you didn't notice explicitly, and you pick up a negative intention from them, and this then puts up your plans in some very serious way, makes it so that you then stop acting in a way that will cause things to go well for you, but instead poorly. Yeah, cool. Looks like we can see people here picking up negative intentions from each other. So frequently the things are hard to detect. So it's okay, well, maybe in the past when people were looking into magical practices and worried about magic and thinking about, how to deal with all of that, well, it looks like it all just maps on. Right, and so, and then when you look at the historical magic traditions, which a couple people have looked into, it looks like they're studying the intention phenomena, and the negative intention content also frequently looks spiritual. So it'll be okay, wow, doing body work on the person, I'm getting a visual image of this creature with gnashing teeth. It's it seems sort of like a demon. Okay, well, that's interesting. And then Christianity says X, Y, and Z about demons and about sin, and it seems like that all maps on here. Okay, so I think that this led a bunch of people to think about the things either, actually or actually prime, which means actually, or actually prime, which means not actually, etc., as being magic. So there's a lot of different ways to think about this. The main problem here is that I think this discoheres pretty strongly with our other beliefs. So I'm not a physicalist. I think the mind is not a physical thing. Nevertheless, I think that there's a strong tendency towards physicalist explanations of things, and very good reasons for this. The proposal that there's direct mind-to-mind interaction, that's the sort of thing that I think could be fine. In my metaphysics, that could work out. Doesn't seem to be a problem. But I'm not going to postulate that without there being very, very good reason, because that's adding in an entirely new dimension of thing, or at least adding something quite new. If I could explain this in the normal physical way, then I absolutely prefer to do that. Good practice as far as parsimony in the development of theories. There's also the problem with, even if you're well, I don't really care about that, let's just posit mind-ons. what are mind-ons? Mind-ons are photons, but for the mind. And so you've got direct mind-to-mind interaction. Well, I mean, there's an interesting question. How fast do they go? What's the speed of the equation of decay? Can you deflect them with mind shields? And if so, can you deflect them in different angles? Photons nicely have speeds and behave like regular physical objects. You could say no. It's all simultaneous. That's nice. That's a testable hypothesis, or at least empirically not equivalent to other things. So maybe we'll be able to eventually test that. But if it seems, when you're building theories, you don't want to add something that requires a whole lot of other posits to be able to understand how it works. And so if you start adding direct mind-to-mind interaction, then I want to know a whole bunch of things about that. In thinking about this, I recently came up with a new way of thinking about what's happening with all of these things. It certainly doesn't preclude the direct mind-to-mind interaction, but I think it's a nice sort of straightforward physicalist explanation that allows for things to be it's nice and simple. There's fairly easy ways to mesh it with some of the things that people normally think either derived from societal wisdom or things discovered through sort of regular scientific tradition. And this is to think about the things as operating on impulses. What do I mean by impulses? Well, there's a sort of general picture that we sort of accept about, or that people in general accept about what happens when you're growing up and being trained or educated. Like one of the things that, so you start off with kids who don't have impulse control. They just do things or say things, or they punch their sister, or they blurt something out, or the kid hears a swear word and decides that now is the time to say it 500 times as loudly as possible. The parents are like, no, don't punch your sister, and can you not say that for the next 13 years? So what you end up with is a picture on which there are overt actions, and then there are impulses. And the impulses are things that would become overt actions, except you catch and suppress them. And one of the things that you're doing when you're raising children is you are teaching them to control their impulses. I think the thing I'm saying here is sort of, cut from the sort of standard societal model of how these things work. Now, if you think about impulses, you could think of those as purely mental phenomena. Maybe there are some like that. But you could also, it's certainly the case that people frequently catch actions in midstream. Someone says something and you respond, that's an excellent proposal. I'd like to think about that. The person goes some way into the action, catches it, stops it. Well, there's going to be a lot of things that you're catching earlier and earlier as you get better and better, more self-controlled. You catch the impulses earlier and earlier. Well, so then what you might imagine is happening in a person is that they have a whole bunch of proto-actions, or they're just actually actions. You could call them micro-actions. And some of them are allowed to continue and become full actions, and the rest are suppressed. How are they suppressed? The easiest way to suppress things probably is muscle tension. You tense the thing, or maybe attentional redirection is a different way to do it. And so then what you get is people having practices for adding muscle tension to their bodies and redirecting their attention that cause it to be that the initial actions don't end up being acted on. So we've got our impulses. Then there's this control mechanism. And then here are the macro actions. The impulses are micro actions.
Is part of the claim that the muscle tension is necessary for that attention redirection?
I'm not sure if it's absolutely necessary. It at least prima facie seems open that maybe as you start an action, you might start another action which guides and directs it rather than locking it down. So it's like, the person, you're like, oh God, that seems like a great idea, right? Where here's a negative active positive response. So it could be that didn't involve muscle tension in the relevant ways. It could be that it always involves muscle tension. Maybe you have to slow it down. Maybe it doesn't involve the permanent addition. I think that the specific dynamics of how this works is something that we can figure out.
Okay. But it at least seems to be common.
It at least seems to be really common. If you think both commonsensically, and if you look at the degree of muscle tension in people's bodies, and if you look at specific cases, and so there's I do think that with muscle tension, after muscles become sufficiently tense, it's hard to tell what's happening in them. So there's like no, the thing's not tense. Oh God, I'm adding tension all the time. Now I'm not. There's a sort of graph like that. Okay, well, so then how does interaction work? This is one person. And here you have another person who has a similar setup. And the way you think about interaction normally is that it's the macro actions. Hi John. Hi Jane. Good to see you. Yes, good to see you as well. There we've got some macro actions, and these guys are going back and forth. And based on which macro actions you perceive, right? Person A takes a macro action, person B perceives it, that leads to the generation of another macro action which person A perceives, and that leads them to take a further macro action. That's normal interaction. If you add to this picture the not incredibly controversial claim that people can perceive each other's impulses to a degree, then you should expect that in addition to the macro actions, there's also going to be micro actions that get picked up on. So A takes this action but suppresses this, B perceives this but also perceives this, and as a result takes either a different macro action or a different micro action. And then maybe in response B suppresses this, A suppresses anger and expresses politeness. B sees the anger and expresses, and then goes to detach but then tries to engage. And then notes the detachment, and so on. So what you would end up with is not just a macro action cycle. You'd end up with macro actions and micro actions leading to macro and micro actions on all sides. Yeah.
So the micro actions aren't necessarily just things they're not just macro actions that are suppressed. They can be kind of like just smaller, more subtle things, right?
Well, it's and it depends what we want to call sort of suppression and so forth. I think that the
it's not like you're seeing like the start of an actual action that could be
I think in a bunch of cases you are seeing the start of an action, but not always.
Not necessarily always.
That's right.
Like I guess like you can project the micro action based intention by kind of like embodying a certain intention in the sense of like, okay, you kind of, we don't have words for this, but like you can add an action to somehow yourself that the other person can pick up but isn't explicit. And then that can be like deliberate itself.
Yeah, that's right. So then in terms of conscious awareness, in some cases the people are aware of the things being suppressed or the things being hidden behind other things, and in other cases perhaps not. Yeah.
So given that minds would be aware of both macro actions and often of micro actions, it seems like the micro action version of something that someone else could pick up will often have different propositional content attached to it, like dramatically different than the macro action, given that your mind should end up anticipating that your micro action would be picked up by the other person. But maybe not. Maybe it's like on the whole, if I keep things micro actions, then there's less of a chance of them being picked up.
I think people will have different views and different people's minds will be set up in different ways. So some people will just be denying that the underlying stuff is happening, or working to suppress
denying
it
in a way where like their entire mind, the rest of their
well,
mind
no. So I don't think they actually end up So there's a question as to how much you get introspective access to. There's also a question of how you choose to interact with this. So it's like people will recognize that they have impulses to at least some degree, and some people will think that everything's governed by impulses. And then people will either try to get rid of the impulses or try to find them and incorporate them into sort of the rest of their way of acting. And frequently this impulse interaction ends up being like very, very important. So when you think about musicians syncing with each other, or actors trying to sort of like read an audience and then interact or speakers while they're reading an audience. One thing that I think is a really great example of this is frequently when there's this phenomenon where when you talk, you can tell whether the words land, not whether they believe them, but at least whether they understood them. And there's this terrible, terrible sense of all the words falling flat as you're saying things. Well, okay, what's happening there? Are you picking up on... Yes, I think, what's happening is that there's very slight things that you're picking up on in the people that show whether or not they are tuned in enough, whether they are listening, whether they understand, whether everyone has become puzzled or everyone has become distracted. Yes, Chris?
Yeah, so there's this concept of micro-expressions.
Yeah.
That'd be an example of a sign.
Yeah. So I'm gonna. So I can say something about that now.
Yeah.
So there's this question as to how much the micro actions are perceptible. I want to say that they are much more perceptible than many people think. And that it's not just and so there's like, micro expressions, Paul Ekman, right? If you sit there and train yourself, you can come to recognize the micro expressions. The claim here is going to be that people, in fact, recognize the micro expressions.
Yeah.
And themselves have micro expressions in response. Yes, you can train yourself to render explicit, but it's not just your face. Okay? Imagine the entire body is having micro expressions all the time, and their body's having micro expressions. And then it's interesting because you can get feedback loops where your micro actions are talking to theirs, and none of it becomes macro. You could think of that as subtle interaction, where the people could be sitting across from each other, no one needs to say a word, raise a hand, and yet this person's impulses affect this person's, and so on. Yes?
Is the control mechanism model meant to be an explanation of why we have micro impulses, or is it just an example that's intelligible of a case where we have micro impulses where people could be like, oh yeah, that's a thing?
The claim is that people in civilization are taught to have control mechanisms. People who don't have control mechanisms will end up in jail, or will, like, if you have societies with no control mechanisms, expect that unless they're very virtuous, the thing will descend into war immediately. Yes?
Well,
Even if you didn't have civilization or control mechanisms or anything, like, you need to order all your actions to accomplish anything in the world. Like, even if you're just out in the woods or whatever. I mean, maybe you can like yell more or whatever, but
Sure.
But like you don't want to yell while the beast is right there and you're about to kill the beast, and the beast doesn't know you're here, right?
Yeah, and so if all the parts of your mind don't order themselves because you're not paying attention and in the right pattern, then you have some part or some intentions not unified with the others that want to yell, and then you also recognize that if you yell, then the leopard eats you, and so you don't want that to happen, and so you suppress the impulses.
Is the idea if we didn't have a need for a control mechanism that we wouldn't have micro actions?
That's the claim.
Weird.
Yeah.
Because they seem useful for other
that's a claim of this simple model, right? So the thing is, what I'm describing here is something that I think is actually largely encapsulated in societal wisdom, except that this is rendering it into a simple causal model, and then dialing up the degree to which the micro actions are recognizable. No.
Two questions. The first is within the CT ontology, what are impulses? And the second is are there going to be any classes of actions in particular that impulses are going to be towards? Or can you have an impulse for anything?
Yeah, so excellent question. Inside CT, impulses are actions. So I'm using the word impulse here to refer to microactions in the context of whether they would be suppressed, or actions in the context of whether they'd be suppressed. But so I'm not introducing a new entity type. These are just actions. There is this question though, and so you get the micro action cycle. You might also say, but is it not possible to have regular macro actions? Well, this reveals that the macro, a person might say, well, let's just ignore all of this and have polite conversation. The claim will be that the only way that you can't actually sort of like factor out the underlying actions because there is this communication. If you have a functional macro action cycle, or in other words, a normal interaction or an overt interaction, it's because the micro actions are stabilizing it and not destabilizing it. You can ignore them when they're fine. But if your anger impulses trigger their anger impulses, trigger your anger impulses, trigger their I'm going to destroy you impulses, trigger your do I have my weapons ready impulses, then the polite conversation quickly degrades.
I think part of the reason this ontology is a bit confusing is you can have things that are just normal actions that are below the level of perceptive reflective awareness for both parties that are really tiny. Yeah. And the micro action thing feels like that also describes those things.
Well, that's what that's meant to be.
But those could be non-suppressed.
Yeah, you've mixed it in with this idea of suppression, which I think is an additional claim that is not necessary to make. It's just like there's big actions that are very visible, and then there's small actions that are more subtle. And it's like we learn to discipline the big ones.
Okay, yeah. So,
but the small ones, like the correlates, the small action correlates of those big ones that we suppressed are still there. But it's not necessary. It's not necessary to describe the small ones as being.
Yeah. So maybe micro and macro is a little bit misleading.
Yeah.
Maybe there's going to be. You can still have the question of which actions get cut off. And the ones that get cut off will be micro actions. You might also very deliberately slightly gesture with your finger in such a way as to indicate the recognition of the person's point, and so on. So it's like people can. I would say
where you could do that without reflective awareness from either
here
person.
is whether it's suppressed or not whether it's large or small. Is that
yeah. So I'm here focusing on whether the things are suppressed, and then I would add that there's something like an as yet unknown pattern as to which of these are ones that people can easily access in such a way that they can articulate that those are things that are happening. Because we do find that there's mental content that people are turning their minds away from, such that you say, but I noticed that your micro action, you did blah. They're like, I did not, in fact, I noticed anger flash across your face. It did not, the person responds. I'm not angry. I just have this tone because I want you to understand what I'm saying to you. So people are going to have, so there's going to be something like, if we were to do this again, maybe here is actions of different sizes, and then there are at least some of the smaller actions are there because they're being suppressed. And so note this.
Wait.
Yeah.
Why do we have to posit that they're there because they're being suppressed?
I'm positing that they're small because they're suppressed.
Okay, here's an alternate model that I think makes a lot more sense to me, is that when you're going to take an action, it's like, let's say, quite a bit of your thinking process and what's going on in your mind is visible through the correlates, the micro-action correlates, sometimes macro-action, right? And then sometimes when we suppress something, it doesn't create micro-actions, it suppresses the big part, but the micro-action correlates are still there.
Yes.
And so it's just you've cut off the big action. The big action didn't happen, but the micro-action correlates are still there. So you can still read that there's that intent in there somewhere. But it's not like the micro-expressions are being created by the suppression. Rather, the suppression is incomplete.
Yeah, sure. It's not that the micro-action arises at first because you have suppressed it. It's more that there would have been a larger macro action, and then you've been working on suppressing the thing closer and closer to the bottom so that you ultimately hope you won't be taking those actions at all.
Right, like you can imagine if an unconstrained action would just be, like there'd be a couple big actions that are visible and then smaller, subtle actions that go along with it. And it would just be like this whole packet of like, let's say 100 different actions of different sizes with maybe 3 really big ones.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is
and then you just cut off, like if you're suppressing that action or not doing that action or like doing it in a subtle way where you're projecting it magically but not acting on it, then you cut off the big parts, but you tend to leave the small stuff. But then poker players and so on also cut out the small stuff.
Well, and there's an interesting question of how far they go. But you could imagine that
they do it better than other people.
You could imagine that they communicate successfully to other people, that the other people should lose to them. There's a number of different phenomena, I think or different possible explanations for those sorts of things. But at least you can have, if you're all your big and small actions, then you can have it be that some actions are suppressed, whereas some actions that are, even though they're small, are not suppressed. And then among the suppressed ones, there's a question as to how much you have introspective access to, and the answer is some.
Well, I think like all, so there's 2 classes of actions. There's the visible ones and the invisible ones. The invisible ones are invisible because they are fully suppressed. They don't exist. They didn't happen, right? And then there's the small ones that didn't get suppressed, and the big ones that didn't get suppressed. And the stuff that's visible is the stuff that didn't get suppressed.
So I think that so I'm going to make the claim that a ton of so it depends how you use the word suppressed. Let's make it analytic on suppressed, that suppressed actions exist. Right? You said you suppressed it so far that it didn't exist.
Like that it didn't happen.
Yeah, so you might obviate the need for some actions. You might have it be that some actions do not occur anymore. But I am claiming that there is this class of action that is occurring that is suppressed. Now I can talk about why I think this, and in fact I'm going to shortly.
So then that would be stuff like the action is still taken, but you take a counteraction.
That's right.
And such that both the action and its suppression are visible.
Both its action and suppression occur, and then there's a question as to whether they're visible. Then the claim is, I think that these things are much more visible than people think. Okay, yes?
I feel that we've become rabbit hole.
All right, well, let us move on. Okay, the remaining thing that we need to do is we need to add to this the idea of complex, subtle interaction, where if you ask people, well, what's the impulse vocabulary? You might say, well, maybe people can say, yes, no, let's mate, or I kill you. And then you can have an interesting conversation where it's like, yes, yes, no, no, let's mate, no, I kill you. Or other things that are like that. The CT has it that, and part of the reason for that is it seems like all of the actions, or it seems like these sorts of actions couldn't possibly be part of a master plan. It seems like they're all disordered. There's just tons of little impulses, etc. CT shows us that in fact everything's part of the larger master plan, which means that the impulses have an order to them, which means that you can get subtle interaction between impulses that can be highly ordered. This means that you could have it be, if the person's impulses are set by an intention, that a person has an intention to take all of these microactions in such a way that it interfaces with your microactions in a way which causes psychological change for you. Causes you to direct your attention, causes you to get various ideas, and then it seems like, well, it's not just determining something like rapport, then this is the sort of thing that could be used to cause substantial changes to people's minds. This, I think, explains the mystery of how you have body workers, who are people who put their hands on people, and then the person experiences noted psychological changes. Answer, what you have is intelligent impulse interaction. Okay. So,
It seems like it still remains confusing how you could have a body reader be across the room with their eyes closed while the other person has like their back facing to them, and they would still be able to get.
Well, it's an interesting question how far. So it's an interesting question. So I think so the question is, well, it seems weird that you could have somebody behind someone, or across the room with their eyes closed. So we haven't done rigorous tests. I don't actually think we can do rigorous tests in a bunch of ways of these things. I think we need to build engineering capacity first. We will end up understanding them better. But you'll notice various things, like it seems like the effects are stronger when the people are in person, when they're looking at each other, when there's physical contact, etc. All of this fits the impulse model. And then there's just a question, person A is behind person B and doing something weird with their hands. But person B is looking at the audience, which is looking at person A. Also, person B can hear person A. Also, we don't yet know how much is being currently driven by the body worker and how much is being driven by the person themselves. So it could be that actually you only need to check in every 15 seconds or something for a lot of things because the person already receives the intention. And so it could be that the people become more and more desynced as the person's behind until the person's like, are you still there? Looks over, they resync, and then the thing continues. We don't know. I do think that at the edges of that, like if you take in the physicalist picture of this, and you go to the most spectacular versions of it, they will look non-physicalist until you understand it really well.
Yeah,
right? So I didn't think about the audience interaction thing until just recently, but that certainly seems like a thing that could be happening.
I think a very important point here is the history of work on issues such as magnetism and light, where spooky action at a distance was the disparaging term for some of the unusual effects we see in those fields, which just basically seem magical.
Yeah. That sounds like an amazing analogy. Yeah. So it's where you have forces, you don't fully understand the forces, then the most extreme versions of those will frequently appear like magic. Now, so again, it remains open to me that, yep, sure, it could be that we have direct mind-mind interaction, but I think that we as yet don't need to posit that, and I'm not going to until necessary for parsimony reasons, also because if you stay inside the CT paradigm, CT doesn't have a slot for direct perception of mental content. So, if one can go outside of that, it's just then you have to start positing all these other things.
Can I add a quick thing?
Yeah.
It just seems like the quality of the listening intention can be improved. Like in acting, they consider it like a more advanced form of basically they call it listening, but it's like tuning into the impulse interaction basically on a moment-to-moment basis. It's more advanced. You don't start doing this without looking or from you can do it from far away, but basically without looking. They sometimes train people back to back. They things like this so that. But that it's first you have to get it when you have a ton of information. You're looking at the person and all of this. So anyway, there's an idea there.
Okay, so what happened was as I now think about what happened, we started off looking at macro actions and things that were easily introspectively available, and it turns out that stuff fits the CT pattern. Cool. That made it so that we could investigate that. But then we found that there was all of this content that it seemed quite hard for the person to access. There were attentional redirects, and frequently when you talk to a person and you're charting them verbally, the person is intention for communication is not one that fits with them getting access to their mind, and so you end up with misdirecting verbal patterns, introspective blocks, attentional redirects, and so forth. Body reading allows us to get beyond those. The idea is that even though the person is able to sort of squish the actions, they don't squish them entirely into non-existence, or some remain, and then it becomes possible to read them. And this makes it so that they don't need to talk, so it doesn't matter what their verbal intentions are, and you still have access to the person's actions, and so you have access to the person's belief system, and you can develop an intention that will cause you to have your impulses interact with their impulses in such a way that you end up receiving information which you can articulate. Okay, cool. Well, so then that makes it so that you, we did have this old problem of how do you defeat the person's OS? How do you get access to the rest of the person's mind? This problem is, at least at the normal level, now defeated, and that's because we can use body reading. The result of this has been that we've gotten access to way, way more of people's minds, and this means that we're able to come to a more complete understanding of humans. I think as a result of, and again, this is the sort of the hit from this has been absorbed the most thoroughly by the people who are in the midst of it, and then other people will feel the sort of penumbras and emanations and whatnot.
Good reference.
But I'm probably misreferencing it, or semi-quoting it. But anyway, so what we end up with is a picture of the mind that is notably more advanced than one we had at the beginning of the year. So I'm going to go through a bunch of the results. So one of the results is that perception yields substantial intention information. I don't think it's correct to say that we are actually perceiving the intentions. What I actually think is happening is that we're having sensations, but something like the mind's ontology is in terms of intentions. And so the immediate interpretation of sensation will be in the language of intention. And so what ends up happening is you end up with essentially a quasi-perception of intention. Of course, we used to think that you could receive sensations and interpret them in such a way that you would understand people's intention. The difference here is the degree. It's, rather than it being low bandwidth, I thought about the person, what they said, and figured out their intention. It's much more like there's a flood that's hitting you at all times, so that there is high bandwidth information about intentions. To say that, so rather than light and occasional, etc., interpretation of sensations so as to yield beliefs about intentions, instead what you have is the very fast, very heavy interpretation of people's intentions such that you can receive a large and detailed imprint of a person's intentions very, very quickly. You're talking and you've got the imprint of the person.
What do you mean exactly when you say the mind's ontologies in terms of...
So there's a question as to what is the ontology of the belief system, right? Is the belief system written in the language of, 3D coordinates, X, Y, and Z coordinates? No. Well, I think it's something like the ontology is intentions, where you...
Including for like rocks and storms.
Yes. And so with a modern scientific understanding, we realize that rocks and storms don't have intentions. The claim would be that the natural way you understand them is that they have intentions.
Okay.
And then you do something with your mind to come to the verbal statement that they do not. Or you make a distinction. Okay. So that's one thing. Another thing that we've learned, we sort of knew this, but there was always hope. But no, the mind is vast. You'd think, well, maybe it's just 300 boxes, no, maybe it's like 900 boxes. Maybe it's as a result of body reading, you get a chance to go through and interact with tons and tons and tons of content. Lots of different areas. It's sort of like, why don't two body readers sync up on the same thing? Are they anywhere close to each other on the map? It's not like the map is like, well, B5, you sank my battleship. It's just like a 12 by 12 grid. It's more like there are hundreds or thousands of compartments with notable information interconnected in some sort of large way. So when you draw a picture, when I draw pictures of the mind now, I tend to draw them, I'll say more about this, where you've got stuff they have more access to, maybe there's some compartments and zones, but then you just have tons and tons of information all spread throughout. And this actually brings me to the next point, which is that the mind is highly compartmentalized. Of course, we knew that people compartmentalized to some degree. We would always wonder, maybe person X just has everything in one big zone. The answer is, or what about fiction? Okay, maybe they just have zones for fictions. It's like, no, the answer is everybody's mind is notably compartmentalized. Again, hundreds, maybe thousands of compartments with important information in them. Again, like I said, suspected, sort of knew this, but now you just can't get away from it. Maybe some people don't have, nope, that's what's happening in people's minds. I have great introspective access, says person X. ha ha ha, says all people who've been interacting with this now. Previously, you might have thought, well, this person has introspective access to everything except for a few little areas. Cue laughter. No. This. Another thing that we found is that the mind has a sequence of worlds structure where the query, what was the world before this, ends up being a very useful query, where it now looks like the mind is set up sort of as if it's progressing through worlds, where you have the world you're living in, and then something happens. Maybe it's you decide that you're just not going to live that way anymore, or you're not going to do X anymore, or you notably change the thing you're doing with your mind, and it's sort of like the mind versions in such a way that now you build out a new one. And so you'll have a complex, interconnected symbolic landscape, or a belief landscape that can be accessed symbolically, built on another one, built on another one. We didn't know about that before. Now we do. Another thing that then shows up from this is the early origin of issues. Brief summary, Freud was right. It just looks like lots of psychological issues stem from things that are developed very, very early in life. And then maybe moving beyond Freud to areas, to things that are further on the fringe. It looks like if you ask what's the world before this a couple times, you frequently end up interacting with content. If you've got visual images, it's like dark, a little sort of reddish. It's like there's not much movement. There's like a little bit, and it's like, am I in the womb? We find this in a bunch of different people, where if you take the thing at face value, and I wouldn't say we have high quality enough justification for the entire sort of thing to just believe straightforwardly all of the results, but if you take it at face value, you just get womb content. And it's like, at what age did you develop that issue? Minus 0.3. And so you'll find that at that point the person doesn't have issues with cell phones. They don't really know about cell phones, but they have synced with what seems like the intention of the world, which maybe is probably their mother. And then you end up with, and maybe they synced with the mother's intention and concluded that their sensations were bad. And then as they are born and then grow up, you end up with that as a deep issue that then other things are built on top of. We previously suspected that many issues arose from early childhood. I think we now have very strong reason to believe this is the case, including strong reason to believe that this happens prior to birth. Yeah.
Maybe good to mention that some of the things predate birth.
I'm gonna get to that. Not in the way that's a more sensationalist thing than I'm going to say, or at least a way of saying it. But so I'm going to add, one of the things we find are, Mia gave us the name basic errors, but basically it looked like people are making all sorts of mistakes early on. It's not just that you synced with your mother's intention and there was a problem there. It's that you failed to unify your visual information with your body information, and so you didn't the perception of your body internally, and so you didn't realize that there was a body, and so you built two different body models, which you then only hackily connected up later on. Or you didn't connect the fact that after you were born, all the stuff that happened to you prior to being born actually is part of the same world. He's like, wow, that's a dumb mistake. No, I mean, you can forgive the child. But so you get these really sort of early on errors. And then we should add to that the sort of lineages of issues, where it looks like you synced with your mother in the womb, she had synced with her mother, and so you may actually be getting sort of transgenerational passage of psychological content. Again, it's a new tool. We get the microscope, we point it at the thing, and it says, okay, pre-birth. Oh wait, issues from people's parents pre-birth. Is the microscope right? Not fully sure. The material seems to cohere, so this is what's currently being indicated. It's a bit shocking, but I think it, again, coheres. So the next thing I'm going to add is that the mind is, it's not just that you're perceiving a lot of intention information. It's not just like you perceive the things and then that's it. It's the things end up, it's not sort of low bandwidth and then you can dismiss it. It's that the intention information is coming in high bandwidth, frequently thoroughly retained, and also frequently can be acted on, which means that it can be disruptive. It can be that you quickly pick up an imprint and now you are acting on that intention. And you had not encountered that intention previously. So this makes it so that, I'll comment on individuality, but this means that essentially people are being permeated by each other's intentions in a way that is able to substantially guide action. Add the next thing, which is control mechanisms. So the impulse suppression idea has that there are control mechanisms, but you don't just add, random things to the mind, or adding like a new piece of architecture. No, the answer is just that people develop action patterns that involve the detection of sensations, the detection of, let's say, the detection of various sensations, which then lead to actions which lock down or redirect other actions. Okay, that's something that I posited as part of the model, but it's also just the case that we have seen people's control mechanisms in a number of cases. So there just are things like this in at least some people's minds, and I'm willing to wager in essentially everybody's mind. It's also the case that it looks like the control mechanisms are imperfect. Speaking from the perspective of the control mechanisms, they think they're doing a really good job at suppressing the impulses. There aren't going to be any problems. They haven't really noticed anything for some time now. Any indication they had that they'd be acting on X, they've managed to eradicate. And in fact, they have a new plan Y, which doesn't have X in it, in some way. What actually is happening is basically so I think what happens is the control mechanisms, there's two uses of the word partition that get used. One is just for representing the divider for any zone that has content you can't introspect on. But then there also seems to be a more general phenomenon of things being below the partition. And so I think what's happening is that you end up with a whole bunch, basically I think you end up with the things that are outside of introspective access that the control mechanism is trying to control. Those things end up being imperfect because in some cases they leak. So if this is the mind, and here are the compartments, and look, you're taking an action, and it's fine. Or you're taking an action from that guy, which you didn't realize was there, but you sort of did. But only in that way in which you sort of generally understand the things in your mind. It's not something you have introspective access to. And so you can have it be that the attempt to control is imperfect and that actions slip out. The other way that, and here I don't think I've got the formulation perfect, but there's a way in which all of the underlying content is seeking to subvert the control mechanism. It's not that you just get to decide what parts of your mind you act on. The mind is, in a deeper sense, unified, and you are trying to achieve all of the goods. And so if you bury a bunch of content here, and there's some goodness involved in it, then it's going to end up occurring in some way. And so then the sort of more thoroughly you manage to lock yourself down so that you have fewer and fewer direct breaches of the control mechanism, the more you'll have it be that the control mechanism ends up inadequately installed. It's sort of like if you imagine that a person has some underlying anger and it's going to express itself in some way, then you look at their procedure for when to yell at someone. The more that you give them sort of jurisdiction over when to make that choice, the more, so you could imagine something like, okay, I will only yell at a person if the following 10 conditions are fulfilled, and we'll have a machine check whether they're fulfilled, so the thing is entirely out of my hands, or we'll have the machine go through and check in each case. Then what you'll find is that in order for the underlying intention to get out, the person will find themselves running the check more frequently in cases so as to enable the underlying thing to be expressed. Now this is, I think, I haven't figured out how to sort of perfectly express this, but one way to put this is that all intentions involve goodness content, and all CT minds see all goods as being achieved. And so this means that all CT minds are going to see all of the intentions being acted on in some way. Now again, there are some ways in which suppression works or redirects, but also it seems like the thing can't ultimately work. And so then this is a thing that, this is a further thing. I should add to this that, why do we care so much about the intention things? Well, it's because it turns out, and this is has been a big hit for the, in the sense of like a thing to cause desimplification. We knew that people had negative intentions. What do I mean by negative? People are like, moral relativism and or don't apply society to me. Use what people normally consider to be bad, what society thinks is bad, historical notions of badness, or things that generally prevent people from achieving their goals. Like take that cluster, things like hatred and destruction and despair and malevolence. Those things that if you imagine your mind overrun with them, things will go badly for you and other people around you. It turns out people have them. We knew people had them, but now we've seen them sort of much more up close and personal. A bunch of body work, you end up with visual images, and so you'll end up with the sort of like, well, I guess I'll talk about that in a second. The thing I want to say first is that a lot of the negative intentions seem to have internal structure and seem to act autonomously. It's not the case that they can actually act autonomously because the mind is in fact unified underneath. But what happens is we've encountered evidence of plenty of negative intentions whose internal logic does not contain conditions for it to be defeated as a result of itself. If the person ultimately sees all the goods as being achieved, then all negative intentions contain flaws. They will always in some way not, in the larger context of the mind, be able to win. But that doesn't mean that the intention itself needs to act in the correct direction. You could have it be that the person has the intention to destroy everything. And they think they'll be stopped by someone at some point. And in the meantime, they're going to act as best they can to destroy everything. Or the person has hatred, and they're going to, or the person has the desire to leave. Why is leaving bad? Well, if we're all aiming at connection, then leaving is contrary to that. The person's decided that people have been too shitty to them, and they will never take a step forward towards other people. Instead, they're going to leave with all the strength that they can muster, and then it is also believed that eventually, at the end of time, they're brought back. We just encounter a lot of intentions like these. Notably, the intentions are also frequently in compartments. Why are they in compartments? Because you're not supposed to act on that stuff. You're not supposed to talk about that stuff. You're not supposed to think about yourself like you are that sort of entity. Someone's like, how are you doing? And you're like, and I'm uninterested in any deeper interaction. This is purely instrumental. The way you're looking at me, I can see so many flaws already, it's disgusting. I want to get as far from humans as I possibly can. And you don't have the strength to stop me because of your own weakness. I guess I'll have a medium latte. You don't say that. And probably when you think that, you're like, no, that's not me. And frequently what you're doing is anytime you notice things, so like in terms of compartments, you'll have a whole bunch of people who have some compartment in their mind with their very slowly growing plan of how they'd be the world's best serial killer. they hear about, serial killer X killed this many people, and they're like, that. And then they start forming plans, and then they're like, no, that gets compartmentalized. And so then throughout all of the person's mind, you'll have some good things, and some neutral things, and some sketchy things, and some really, really nasty things. And these are throughout here. If you're like, let's go break open all the partitions all at the same time and let the person's content all intermix. Like, at this point, I currently think that will yield catastrophe because there is a lot of negative intention. And so I mentioned sort of seeing the things sort of more up close and personal. In terms of how the things look, you get visual images, and it's like, okay, here you have something that just, what's the best natural description of it? It looks like a demon. Yeah, it's, got horns and red eyes, and it's gnashing at me. Let me try to articulate some hatred. Okay, all right, that's interesting. What are the conditions? Okay, wow, the thing is attacking me now. You just, these things are encountered. And not like, oh, they're rare. Like, I'll bet, as that all or essentially all humans will have these. Yeah.
Give a statement of negative intentions.
Yeah, so negative, think normal cluster type concept, right?
Yeah. Quick answer to the question of if this tends to yield catastrophe. There was a phase in the past where some people, including myself, were de-zone everything all the time. It was my explicit protocol that I would do for months and months and months, and some things happen, some bad things happen, and didn't yield catastrophe. So it could be that it wasn't effective enough.
I disagree.
It could be that it did yield catastrophe.
Kersey's official statements are that his intentions seem fine.
I didn't get like sickness and I don't know.
Well, so this is sort of to the point where,
as far as we know,
you de-zone a bunch of stuff, and the official part of your mind that doesn't have the buried things sort of accounted for, etc., reports that everything is fine. And then you look at the sort of person's actions overall, and you're like, mixed. What's happening? And so, the thing is that this yields a picture of humans on which people are substantially worse and substantially less reliable in a particular way. I used to think about this like, we're generally benevolent. There'll be some negative intentions. When those show up, we can clean them up. Now I think we're generally sketchy and bad in a bunch of ways, and it's going to take a lot of effort for us to make ourselves good. Yeah.
I just briefly say I do think that the new reading stuff is opening up.
Oh, that's right.
Negative ones much more so than the way that people were approaching dezoning before.
I think that's right. So I think, in the past, look at the order in which you chose to go through content, right? You'll be like, let's go in an order that seems generally okay. Whereas the body reading stuff, you're just like, here, let's just connect these guys.
Would you say perhaps you've come to believe that human beings are fallen?
Let me, so I'm going to say a few things about humans in general, so let me summarize this. I've now come to the belief that people are, let's see. Well, that's interesting. I think I am going to say yes on fallen. I'll say why in a moment. Because it presupposes a state in which they were not problematic. So people are permeated. So summary: people are permeated by surrounding intention information. This starts before birth and may come down through lineages. This includes a large number of powerful negative intentions. People's early experience is also very hard for them to interpret, yielding lots of basic errors. The result of this is a substantial early structuring of the mind. The mind ends up shattered. It ends up compartmentalized as a result of the received intentions, which may lead it to compartmentalize, as well as the sources of the basic errors. It's just really hard to weave the things together. The mind is confused. This arises from basic errors and intention sync with negative intentions. And the mind is also made worse. It's made morally worse by both the compartmentalization and the received negative intentions. On the positive side, I think the mind is also structured. It is informed and it is bettered. You can also receive positive intentions. You can receive intentions that lead you to manage your mind in a way that leads to less confusion, and you can receive sort of substantial information. We don't know whether, like, how far this goes. Probably the children prior to birth are not receiving the launch codes, but it might be that they are receiving intentions for how to govern the general compartmentalization structure of their mind. You could imagine things like this yielding different national characters, or different sort of characters passed down through families. After that, people's minds then develop through subjective stages. This is the world before this phenomenon. People end up with control mechanisms which stabilize them and manage the negative intentions. I think the details of the control mechanisms will differ across civilizations. There's more to be looked into there. And I think the control mechanisms are imperfect. They can falter and I think are constantly being subverted. This suggests some changes, at least changes to how I was thinking about things. First, individuality. Like, people are really permeated by each other's intentions. This, at least, like, is a major hit against however you were thinking about humans as sort of individual or sovereign from the beginning. I think sovereign individualism is something that is achievable, but it looks like this is the sort of thing that people aren't starting remotely close to. In fact, they're starting very thoroughly permeated by other people. On the mind as a blank slate, so a strict interpretation of CT does actually yield the mind as a blank slate, except for the rules of CT. But then immediately after that, it looks like the mind encounters a vast amount of information, which structures it and affects it dramatically. The structuring is difficult, but not impossible to change. So I think so this is why I'm going to say, yes, I now think that humans are fallen. At least for each individual human, I think that in concept, the mind is starting off at the first moment not affected by the negative intentions, but also not fortified against things and inside of a landscape that's too difficult for it to understand, and then it gets swamped by the environment.
It also sounds like you think that the corruption is coming from the world of sensation.
I think we might look to Kant say though I do believe that all of that starts that cognition begins with sensation. It is not the case that on that account it all arises from sensation. For Kant scholars, I'll argue with you about some details on whether that actually applies in this case, but I do think that it's going to turn out that, unsurprisingly, I'm going to be in favor of the unity of the intellect and sensation, and so, not planning on leaving the world. As far as moral quality of humans, negative intentions, I think, will exist so long as they are conceivable, because as soon as you encounter the thing, your mind will pick it up. The key question for negative intentions is whether they exist in the proper place in a person's mind. And so I think it is possible to have it be that people do manage negative intentions, but the way to manage them is to have it be such that they're part of a model which understands when it is appropriate to act on the relevant intention. There will be something good about destruction, and there will be times when it turns out that anger or hatred, etc., are in fact the correct move. And a model that shows you everything and shows you the time and place in which to do those things is one that will have it be that the negative intention is adequately controlled. I do think that at this stage in history, human minds are not generally set up to put negative intentions in their proper place, which means that it is not the case that at this time in history, humans are particularly good. The thing you want to state this more fully is negative intentions mastered by them being included in a model that gives them their proper place by including them alongside the corresponding positive intentions and weaving all the intentions into a plan that brings about the achievement of the person's goals in a timely manner. I do think that, I want to say, something like Christianity was correct about the sinfulness of humans. It depends what you mean by sinfulness. But I currently, the conception I'm currently working with is that sin, quote unquote, can be thought of as the way that despair undermines the intellect. And I think that people being sinful indicates that there is a deep undermining of what we're doing overtly by subterranean forces of despair. And I do think that, in fact, we see these different elements. There is a question about the degree, but the way that this has changed the way that I'm thinking about myself and other people is before it was sort of like benefit of the doubt to the thing on the surface. The person says that they have the relevant benevolent intention for the world and for themselves and are doing useful work on blah while also not trying to do A, B, and C. I now believe that that's interesting and certainly relevant. But in fact, the thing is being subverted on all sides, or on many sides, that it is possible to stop the things from being subverted by achieving an adequate degree of unification of the relevant intentions, but we're not that close. Yes?
What do you mean by despair here? Or how do you define it?
I think of despair as resignation fortified by IPs.
Where this is sort of like resignation on the proximal achievement of some good.
Yeah, so they're like, I will achieve X at the end of time.
Yeah, okay.
And not before.
And then there's a claim
I
that
want to run something by you if I may.
Say again?
I want to run something by you if I may, just to check my current understanding of, the lecture and everything.
Sure. I'm going to let people know. I'm going to go 15 more minutes.
So something like a fundamentally pro-social nature to human minds where nearly always there has to be a justification that's ultimately pro-social for most antisocial action. And the justification might be they're not really people, or actually through destroying everything I see in an invisible way, I'm actually creating everything, and things like this. And I've got a lot of mileage out of analyzing ideologies. For example, I think social Darwinism is mostly a rationalization for operating in highly predatory social environments. You'll end up being social Darwinist if you say work on Wall Street. Because what you're doing all the time is clearly destroying organization and value. But you need justification for why this is good. So the proposal is by destroying all of these bad firms, you're actually like giving information back into the world, facilitating the growth of good firms, which is like a very questionable thing. Or maybe you have a view that what can be destroyed should be, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so on and so on. I'm curious about, like, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this, but I'm curious if it's, like, consistent or not.
Yeah, so let me say a sort of multi-part response. So first, I do think that the person always sees the basic goals being achieved in the end, so all of the bad stuff ultimately falls to the good things. I also think that very frequently the things that appear as bad have a lot of good, have good elements, and the badness occurs as a result of things being left out. And so I think that in tons of cases, just directly analyzing the phenomena the way you describe it is correct. A new thing that I've added to this, though, is that I think that in many cases, the actual operational intention is something that doesn't have a provision for success in anything like the near term. So the person will have a superficial justification that they are doing social Darwinism for the sake of X, Y, and Z, when in fact they want to see the blood of their enemies run in the streets, and this is the closest they've been able to get. And then after it runs in the streets, everything sort of decays, and then at the end of time, everything is united again. I think that those intentions, in the more stable the society, the more it's going to have intentions that are winning, that sort of comport with order. And so I think when you, like, these sorts of things, I think are going to be more likely to be sort of upstart things rather than things that create standing social orders. So I think the standing social orders will be more likely to be imperfect in that they capture and incorporate some goods and not others, and don't have the runaway negative intention as the thing that's animating the society in the very near term. It could be that our society now is operating on an intention to destroy itself, but that's sufficiently attenuated by the good intentions that we're all planning on that happening over the course of a long period of time. You might think that something like the belief in the inevitability of death is something that will give everyone a point in their plans such that at that point everything will have to have failed. And so it could be that, so basically I think there's a mixture of good things missing a bunch of elements, runaway negative intentions with surface explanations of themselves as good, and the underlying dynamics being that. Yeah.
Because if you talk to like Wall Street people, they're not going to say they basically believe in social Darwinism or through the victory of positive sum intentions through like intensive negative sum intention interaction. But this is going to be like usually their subconscious thing, in the sense that I found it very easy to appeal. Like for example, like they will consume political news, even though political news is completely irrelevant to their actual work. For the reason of they can tell themselves that they're acting on special information and analysis. And I've noted that often you can tell who is consuming various kinds of information in order to enable their rationalizations rather than to act directly. And I came to this view through studying very closely what people do with social knowledge and having achieved some degree of both like cynicism and deep optimism as to what can be done with social knowledge.
Yeah, so I think I generally agree.
With social knowledge is like demolish justifications or build new justifications, and it's very important what kind of justifications you're demolishing and what kinds you would build.
Yeah, so I generally agree, and let's I'd be interested in talking about that more when we meet up next. Okay, so the briefer summary is I think people are affecting each other more than we thought. People are worse than we thought. This changes the understanding of humans. Group dynamics as a field. Things should be their own fields when you have conceptually semi-isolated areas that have their own logic to them. This happens either when you have things that don't have ontological distinctions, so you have physics, chemistry, biology, etc., but just where there's different levels of analysis are useful. You also get fields in areas where there's a new batch of information that comes in and informs the thing. You don't use CT to tell us all what we think is going on with regard to the physical objects in the room, because yes, it has to do with like beliefs, but also there's this thing about physical objects where the physical object facts are the larger determiners. Group dynamics is like that, in that what's happening is, yes, I think CT is the physics, or at least that's the paradigm, but people have something like perception of intentions, and so the intention facts determine the environment, and so the field of group dynamics is going to be sort of like the field of understanding people's what people believe on the basis of visual perception, where you have to understand the intentions in order to understand what's happening with people. So I think that this makes it so that group dynamics is rightfully its own field, and I wanted to note that. Okay, so there we were, happily hacking away at the OSs. This all seemed fine. And then we succeeded, and we got past the partitions, yay, and were able to see way, way more of the mind through body work. This made it so that we could start deconstructing the control mechanisms in people's minds. And this through many different means. I mean, you could just remove a partition. It's not as easy as just, but you can do it. And then there's all this new content. Or with simple body work, you can go in and find two compartments and connect them. Or with precision body work, you could make various types of alterations. You go in here, and move this over here, and change this, and move this over here, and so on. And then through vibe articulation and body reading, you end up getting content from people and surfacing it so that now you have introspective access to it. And so you're taking a whole bunch of content and putting it up here, and then you have a conversation with someone, and you tell them the thing that you found. And so this made it so that there's more moving on underneath, and a lot more underneath being brought up to the surface. As we did this, we found, I think that this simultaneously led to a number of things that were related. One, the increased release of negative intentions. In a number of cases, there were negative intentions which were buried. We cracked open the partition. You might make jokes about the mines of Moria and how deep the dwarves decided to go. There's something like this here, where it's like you want to pace yourself in interacting with the negative intentions. Also, there's this phenomenon where negative intentions, they don't all get suppressed and put into the compartments. What ends up happening is that frequently people learn to express their negative intentions in socially acceptable ways. And so if the person has underlying hatred, they're not allowed to just walk around punching people. But, maybe they are allowed to, not to pick on police officers, but you could become a police officer. And then there'll be various points at which it's possible to make things will fall under individual judgment, and you could have it be that the negative intentions get acted on. I think that the negative intentions end up forming adaptations where, and so I'll use myself as an example. My intention is to help people pay attention to reality. So they say a thing to me, and I refute them. And my refutation is designed to help them pay attention to reality. It also turns out that I had the intention to dismiss people in a particular way because I'm upset with people because of large numbers of, things. That wasn't something I was really paying attention to. There was this perfectly socially acceptable justification, which is that we're here pursuing the truth as part of a activity that we agreed on, and people know that we're doing that. We know that arguments are useful, and when you say something, Socrates said that it's better to be refuted than to refute, and so I'm actually just helping the person. And in fact, I am helping the person. But also, there's this thing behind that, where my reaction to people is like, why are you refuting me with that hard edge in your voice? I don't know. That's an interesting question, but let's stay on topic. So you can have it be that the negative intentions end up sort of like forming a shadow behind the person's regular actions, where there are the regular good intentions that the person is acting on, and also something that has come to fit the form of the regular actions in such a way that it's quite hard to detect the negative elements. It's also the case that the negative intentions form adaptations, where people are like, well, you can't just focus on, so highly caricaturized version of what happened. You can't just, Geoff, you have to take into account people's emotions and so forth. It's not just about, reason and so forth. I'm like, okay. I see that you're upset. Let's see if any of that can be turned into an argument. People are like, no, you have to empathize with people. I'm like, okay, that's hard. Let's see if we can turn any of that into an argument. You can't just pressure, okay. That's hard. Let's just give you as much time as you need to process that and work through it. And then we can look to see whether any of that can sort of be turned into an argument. And so I think that my turning it into the argument thing is simultaneously motivated by truth and by control and by a bunch of sort of other things. But in terms of changing the underlying intention, you can see that you could learn to add a whole bunch of superficial adaptations onto an intention to have it be that it appears more and more acceptable to other people despite having various elements, where I think the control intention is good or bad depending on circumstance. Likewise with truth, the thing that I would say would be the most problematic that I've found is maybe the dismissal intention. But so then you end up with negative intentions pockets being broken into, people being able to detect negative intentions in regular things where they couldn't detect them before, and including where you have all these adaptations where it looks to you for the world like you're acting on the good intention when in fact there's the negative intention with a whole bunch of sort of exciting adaptations. And so you increase the release of negative intentions, the ability to detect negative intentions, and also increased instability in the face of negative intentions because we're deconstructing people's control mechanisms. What does that do? The result of that is that puts us into the midst of an escalating intention war. Should I call it an intention war? It's definitely not as bad as it could get. Not even remotely as bad as it could get. Look at previous societies. Look at tribal societies of people accusing each other all of magic and negative intention phenomena and going to war with each other. So I might call it intention skirmishes, but I don't want to trivialize the thing. I do think that this is the largest event of this type that any of us have experienced. I think it's having huge effects on people. The way, I guess I'm going to go to 150, I apologize. the way in which this is weird and hard to deal with is sort of like, so let me give some examples. And some people will have been involved in conversations like this and others won't. But you should know that this is the sort of thing, and this is like a little caricatured, but not really. So there you are, having a conversation with Jane. It seemed nice, though there was something subtly off. Now you have this weird feeling in your chest. Is it love? No, maybe it's indigestion. Okay, it's growing. Does it have anything to do with Jane? You keep thinking of her. You're getting strong visual images of her smiling and waving at you in a creepy way. You try to introspect. Wait, now your mind is locking down. It's incredibly painful. You're sitting motionless, hoping that the thing will pass. Your thoughts are closing off. Eventually, you reach a phone and text John. John, Jane did something weird to me. Are you sure it's Jane? Said John. You seem to be blaming her for a lot of things recently. Well, can you just come and help me? All right, fine, I'll come. 5 hours later, John helped you out of the thing. It was quite painful. You missed all your meetings for the day. I'm still not sure it's Jane, said John. You're not sure either. Should you accuse her without knowing? The conversation with her seemed perfectly normal except for the weird thing that seemed off. Okay, so that thing is happening. You meet with Fred. Steve, your name is Steve in this, by the way. He says, you've been hurting me a lot. How? You, as Steve asked. I can't tell you, said Fred. Let me show you. Fred holds out his hand. You touch Fred's hand and concentrate. Now you have a sense of something. You're avoiding it. You pay attention and overcome the avoidance. Is it that I'm angry at you? I don't feel angry, but I think I see the thing you're pointing at. That's part of it, says Fred, but look more. You continue to concentrate, but you can't make anything out. Okay, says Fred. I guess you're blocked right now. You're meeting with Anne and Bob. The conversation seems to be fine, and suddenly Anne raises a contentious issue with Bob. Why do you have to raise that now? Asks Bob angrily. That's not what we were talking about. I don't know. It seemed irrelevant, said Anne. I don't think it is relevant, says Bob. They look at you. Remember, you're Steve. Can you check for weird intentions? You sense the field. There seems to be something in Anne. I think there's something in Anne. I can sense it also, says Bob. I think it's coming from you. It's not coming from me, you explain. You check, is it coming from me? No, wait, it's just pretending to be from you, says Bob. It's actually from Charlie. I don't think it's Charlie, says Anne. That doesn't make any sense. Can you detect it, says Bob. No, says Anne, but I still don't think it makes sense. Well, I think something bad is happening with Charlie, says Bob. He then talks for several minutes about how Charlie is undermining other people and undermining the project. You find yourself more and more convinced. The ones that actually happen have more hedges in them and take like 5 times as long, but essentially like that sort of thing is happening. I think the intention war is a combination psychological, socio-psychological, and social phenomena. You have the control mechanisms which are implemented in people's minds, that's the psychological part. But they're also implemented, like people help each other to maintain them, like they depend on interactions with other people. And this happens through other people's intentions. So the other people have intentions that help to stabilize you. And then there's also overt behaviors that are taking place. So the control mechanisms are you psychologically, you in intention interaction, and you in regular overt interaction with other people. So then the breakdown of control mechanisms is also all 3. And then what ends up happening is as the mechanisms for control break down, you end up with things that social norms sort of aren't designed to handle. This happens in sort of like 2 important notable ways. One of them is you end up with cases that just you never interact with. Like, I found a mental object in me that was trying to shut me down and prevent me from seeing it. I think John gave it to me. Whose fault is that? Is that John's fault? Is that your fault? Is it the culture's or the group's fault for not protecting you adequately? Should you raise the thing? Should you send a polite note? Should you add epistemic hedges? Maybe the epistemic hedges just make it so that the other person, make it so that you're like focusing extra hard on what you know, which is part of a control mechanism, which is animated by a negative intention, et cetera, et cetera. It's like super hard to figure out what to do in these cases. it's also the case that really frequently the disruption isn't coming from the belief. It's coming from the reorganization of the material. So to like get this, like, so imagine, so in a lot of cases, like Jane and John are in a monogamous relationship, and Jane thinks that John is cheating on her. Well, she dismisses the thoughts and so forth, but if you get her to belief report, she will belief report that John is in fact cheating on her. She feels sad about this. Then John announces to Jane, Jane, I've been cheating on you. She freaks out. Well, the belief report didn't change. She already believed this. The thing that changed is the way that she now has to interact with that, where now she can't dismiss it, turn her attention away and so forth. She has to interact with other people. It enters it into the overt social landscape in a notably different way. And so if you realize that what's happening isn't just, so then what you can end up with is, as the control mechanisms break down, you end up with a ton of borderline cases where it's hard to figure out what you should do at all. And you also end up reorganizing information, which will then lead to the generation of normally problematic things at a much, much higher rate. So you aren't planning on, causing harm to a person. You don't think you're causing harm. Didn't sound that harmful. You gave them a whole bunch of information about the material that you found underneath when you did body work on the person. Okay, cool. You now have just taken a whole bunch of information from here and put it up here, which is then going to cause changes in the person's behavior in various ways. But this is all happening in a way where the social norms aren't adapted to that sort of information being put in. And so social norms have something about like the rate at which you raise problems with people. They have things about like what the total load is, how severe things are, how you should respond to things. Things have been hard for Jane recently, so don't mention X, right? This is part of the social norms. And so as we shift all the content around, you get stuff that's going to be released in a way that is not, the previous social norms aren't going to allow us to handle the rate. Okay, so I don't think that we should descend much further into the intention war. I do think that we have to continue developing our ability to train people. Training people involves interacting with the people's minds and figuring out how to get the content in the person's mind arrayed properly. This will involve digging into people's minds, breaking partitions, reorganizing things, etc. What this means is we need to figure out how to do this while adequately managing the negative intentions. And so this yields the paradigm for, and so this I credit to Emily. We've talked a lot about culture. We haven't had like a sort of paradigm for thinking about it. I think I can now state this. And when I say culture, I mean like when anthropologists go and study a particular culture, they like will describe the rites and rituals and practices and totems and etc. I think that there may be other reasons for culture as well, but and this is the thought. I think that culture is a shared set of practices that exist to manage intention phenomena, and specifically to suppress, control, manage, etc., negative intentions. There's a pre-existing culture that interacts with and manages and suppresses and lets out at the right times negative intentions. And as we interact with people's minds and are able to cause larger changes, we are destabilizing the control mechanisms. This means that if humans were good enough, we would not need to worry about this. We could just let all the intentions out and the good ones win and we're fine. In fact, I think humans are not adequately good. In particular, we are not adequately good. And so we can't go to a state absent there being this sort of control mechanism. And so I think that we need to continue the research and training. We're going to be interacting with intention phenomena for some time. Maybe eventually we'll decide to back out and do something else. But until then, we need to have a culture that enables us to do this without getting overrun by negative intentions. The surrounding culture doesn't have the resources for it, and so we need to create a new one. In my next presentation, I will talk through and set up this challenge. But this is the challenge of having a shared set of practices that allow us to manage, suppress, release at the right times, etc., our negative intentions.
Is the intent of creating new culture mostly scoped to avoiding problems that are coming up with negative intentions, or is it broader than that?
So I would say that we will discover other things that it's very useful for. Like what about positive intentions and shaping and etc. Yeah, absolutely. The thing is that you when you set up a paradigm to work inside of, you need something that you've got sufficiently clear justification for, so that everyone can return to it as a touchstone. And as you see things starting to dissolve because of negative intentions, as well as this background theoretical framework for understanding what's happening there, plus our ability to detect them and so forth, it's like, okay, there's this thing that needs to be managed. That's task number one. And also, I imagine that we're going to find lots of useful things that we can be doing while we do that. Yeah, I think that probably only focusing on the negatives means doom. I think that if you just focus on defeating the negatives or overcoming the negatives, you won't have enough positive stuff coming into the system and the whole thing will collapse. So it's phrased in terms of negatives because that's a clear way to state the problem and makes it clear what we have to do.
If I can comment?
Sure.
The reason I stayed out of the intention war as much as I could is because it pattern matched very strongly to normal signs of moral hysteria and normal signs of escalating warfare, where the key thing I tend to believe happens with social justice, which is deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, is that the microaggression concept brings people's attention to minute negative intents in other people. So in fact, the microaggressions social justice complains about are real. However, they are always, without exception, brought up in bad faith, which is something the social justice people are not comfortable with. So if you go, read something like Jim.com, he's going to correctly point out how social justice always seems to serve insanity and evil. And if you go read something like Ozzy's Tumblr.com, you'll realize that, if you check if you introspect on some of the problematic intentions the social justice people point to, they in fact have shitty reasons behind them. And in fact are not omnibenevolent, and in fact are not just in the service of supporting, good things in society.
Yeah, so I think the analogy there is...
I'm saying that the social justice discourse generates intention war, and it's not the only kind of discourse that can. I think some kinds of cults and fundamentalist Christianity and Phariseeism and so on do the same sort of thing. And it's one of the common patterns of explosive religious craziness, because religion combines normative statements about which intention should be or should not be suppressed together with introspective technology. So different religion templates result in different things. For example, I think we rediscovered with belief reporting some elements of Quakerism, where the Quakers would gather in a circle and would wait until one of them was moved by the Holy Spirit to speak. Now, what the fuck is the Holy Spirit? Can this be absolutely terrifying and awful, and you should stay away from it? Yes. Or maybe this Quaker circle could allow you to, unearth deep emotional trauma or whatever. It would depend on the concrete Quakers.
Yeah, I think the analogies here are really good. And I think you might, there's going to be a thing here where I think in general our group is culturally sort of anti-control. And I think there's going to be a very uncomfortable element of this where I'm okay, well, we need to learn how to...
I used to be heavily pro-control, so I apologize if I'm
No.
With these statements accidentally pushing the group in the wrong direction.
No. I think the thing you said is fine. The thing that's notable is I think that there's an empirical claim. There's what's the goodness and badness load, so to speak. Is it possible, do we just have enough that you don't need to control things and you let all the things out and they all talk to each other and they make friends? I'm making the empirical claim that that's not true, and that's why we're going to have to move. And so when I'm saying the direction of a culture which is aimed at the suppression and control of negative intentions, you're what? How, but, etc. Aren't we supposed to let all the things free? It's well, a bunch of the things are bad. we had to figure out how to manage this. Now, of course, if we block the things off forever, this messes with people's pursuit of their goals as well as their training trajectories, and so there's a tough challenge here to be made. But there's this you should be thinking of this as moving in the direction of control, because there is a thing to be controlled. Yes.
So you're saying we have to spiritually leave California?
We may have left California in a spiritual sense long ago. Okay, that's all.